Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Planning Your Hybrid Cloud Deployment with Citrix Cloud. My name is Sarah Queen, and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager for our services portfolio here at Citrix. In today's session, our consulting team will share deployment models, key design considerations, and technical guidance for your cloud transition, with many lessons learned throughout. We will then close with the services offerings that are available to support your cloud journey. Before we get into the presentation, let me quickly review a few housekeeping details. We will have a live Q&A session toward the end of today's event, and you're welcome to submit your questions during the presentation. Simply type your question into the Ask a Question window and click Submit. Also, we are recording this event, and the on-demand version will be available from the same link that you used to join today. So feel free to come back, watch the archive, or share it with your colleagues. Finally, the slides are available for download from the Event Resources tab located along the top of the interface. Okay, now I'll hand it over to Kevin Nardone, Enterprise Architect and our Cloud Expert today on our Americas Professional Services team. Kevin?
Thank you, Sarah. First off, I definitely want to take the time to just go over some goals for today. Like Sarah mentioned, we're really going to start off and go through some of the key architectural considerations for Citrix on a public cloud, really highlighting the differences on and how you should approach a project or initiative of moving Citrix to a public cloud and how it may differ, as well as taking time for, what is sizing? How does sizing differ on the public cloud when you use Citrix? How about, how do you take advantage of infrastructure consumption or that IaaS consumption, as well as some lessons learned throughout of what we've seen in the field for, moving XenApp and XenDesktop to the cloud. But for those who might not be as cloud familiar, we'll take some time to just kind of go over what are the standard, cloud computing stacks. You have infrastructure as a service. Think of this as provisioning a virtual machine on a AWS or Azure platform where they're managing the actual infrastructure, but you're still responsible for the OS, anything running and installed on that operating system. Then you also have PaaS, also known as Platform as a Service. This is where that OS and everything that really encompasses that, as well as the infrastructure, is run, and you're more responsible for the apps and data. And then lastly, you have software as a service. This is pretty much end-to-end. You consume the software and you can leverage it for value within your organization. So every company approaches cloud differently, and as organizations look at cloud, they really might be, and especially when they look at Citrix for the cloud, they might be in many different aspects of what I like to call the enterprise cloud journey. For those of you on the call who are really in this webinar to approach cloud from a new perspective, Citrix might be the first system you're ever going to put in a public cloud or cloudify. At this point in time, you're really thinking about, how do we establish policies? What are the ways that we can leverage Azure? How do we set up that connection? What are the questions, that we need to ask around virtual networks and security that we might not be familiar with in an on-prem infrastructure mindset? So that's, we're going to take some time to kind of highlight a few of those avenues as what I like to dub as a cloud builder. Where you're really approaching, how do we monitor these costs? How do we experiment and really get to learn cloud? And as you continue to consume cloud, you might fall into what I like to call a cloud consumer. This is when it gets into operationalizing some of the lessons learned from that initial cloud project, whether it be, taking an on-premise application, you've brought that into the cloud, and then Citrix is shortly following suit, and you're at a point where, we're familiar with cloud. We have some expertise around AWS. We're going to now forklift an entire department into cloud. We want to maybe shut down a data center. We want to consume cloud and increase that overall consumption. It gets down to enforcing the policies that were established for your cloud and continuing to optimize costs. And IT slowly starts to shift into a form where they're maybe using more service providers within their organization as well. And then the last piece in the cloud journey I like to call is the cloud broker. A cloud broker is where now you have a very established cloud relationship, either with an AWS, series of SaaS providers, and you may be even approaching cloud in a way where any solutions that are pulled into your organization, you're going to be cloud first or cloud only for that solution. It'll be your first form of criteria. And at this point in time, especially, you might have Citrix already in the cloud. You might be leveraging some workloads, and it comes down to, how do we get to a point where, Citrix, I want to use it with multiple clouds. What's the best way to take advantage of that model? How do I get to a point where I can broker costs across my clouds to optimize costs, prevent vendor lock-in, maybe target different regions that make more sense financially to use Azure versus an AWS or vice versa. And a lot of organizations that are at this phase, their IT has really shifted into a point where they're now, outside of some of the systems management you may be familiar with today and in a standard traditional infrastructure model, and they may have started shifting to where their internal IT is more solution-focused, directing a series of managed service providers or SaaS vendors to accomplish their overall goal. So going from this cloud journey, it really gets into, how can we deploy Citrix on a public cloud? So first, I'd like to talk about the extend model. So this is when you have Zen App, Zen Desktop on-premise. You're looking to deploy, say, a virtual app or desktop workload from that on-premise infrastructure. So for instance, you're a cloud builder, you're looking to experiment with public cloud, and you want to then, you want to do just maybe a simple application, maybe it's something that's seasonal, but you're not ready to build like a full Zen Desktop site or forklift your existing site into a public cloud vendor. What you can do, especially with the latest versions of 7.15 LTSR, you can create a host connection and end up creating a zone, for instance, within an Azure data center to test and utilize the first app, start simple, and build from there. Now, the difference here is, you're managing that infrastructure on-premise within your data center, and the virtual app and desktop will be in the public cloud, so you won't manage the infrastructure there since you're using an IaaS model, and the overall system will be managed by corporate IT or a managed service provider if you've offloaded that to a partner or Citrix. The next piece gets into hosting. So this takes that extend model where you're provisioning just VDAs within a zone within a public cloud. This gets into what we like to call a forklift, where you take the entire Citrix infrastructure, so the management controls like the delivery controllers, storefront, and you place everything within a public cloud, including your virtual app and desktop workloads. So for instance, you want to do cloud disaster recovery. You're at a point where you're familiar enough with public cloud and Azure that you want to use, that as a platform for disaster recovery, so you don't have to, set up a full data center and you pay for, what you use. You want to optimize that. There's one example of some customers approaching a forklift, or you're ready to just close down the data center. You have some familiarity with Office 365. You're at a point where, let's continue and build this Azure relationship. We're going to shut down a couple of branches, move those Citrix sites into Azure, and manage that as if it were our own data center. So when you host and you manage that forklift model, again, the delivery controllers, the Citrix management, all exist within that public cloud, and those virtual app and desktop workloads as well will exist within the same public cloud, or creating host connections to other subscriptions, regions, et cetera, all of which is managed by your organization or a managed service provider. So the last model with deploying Citrix in a public cloud is leveraging a cloud service or Citrix Cloud. This is when you take that those delivery controllers, those management components, and you offload them to Citrix into more of like a platform as a service model, a pseudo platform as a service, where things like the delivery controller, database, they're managed by Citrix. And then the virtual app and desktop workloads would then be a resource location that would then be managed by your corporate IT or a managed service provider again. So for instance, the site upgrades, the features, functionality, you want to shift that into more of a cloud service so you can focus more on your IP, focus more on your workloads, utilize that centralized control plane to manage multiple clouds, and even manage in a hybrid fashion where you have, your on-premise data center. There might be something there in a private cloud. You want to utilize Azure. You're at that cloud, broker phase where you have a lot of Azure footprint. It's time to start thinking about diversifying and utilizing AWS to prevent vendor lock-in. The cloud service is something that can facilitate that by centralizing your Citrix management into a platform. So now we kind of have a decent understanding of just some of the different ways to go through and deploy Citrix in public cloud. Let's take a look at just some of the different, let's dig a little bit deeper, go through just some of the components that compromise all of these different architectures. So there's first traditional on-premise. You have your workloads, your VDAs, your license server, your delivery controllers. These would all exist within your on-prem data center with users connecting, say, externally through a NetScaler or things along those lines. Extend, again, it gets into setting up that VPN or express route or a direct connect if you're using AWS, where you'd have your on-prem infrastructure like your primary zone with the 7.15 LTSR architecture, traditional Citrix, and you'd then create a secondary zone within one of your public cloud subscription or multiple. So connecting through that VPN or express route, you'd most likely have a pair of delivery controllers within that subscription with the VDAs registering and being brokered from that subscription, as well as users with something like optimal gateway routing, for instance, where if users go and hit that zone, you want them to preferentially connect to the NetScaler that's within that subscription versus the NetScaler that's on-premise is one example. The next piece, host, really getting into the components, again, very familiar. This is pretty much deploying a Citrix infrastructure just in someone else's data center, being it Microsoft's or Amazon. Similar components that you would see in an on-prem architecture, except within a public cloud subscription, where you're focusing more on consumption-based resources than the capital expenses you may see setting up a data center. And then the next piece is the cloud service. So what do we shift into Citrix Cloud as part of our cloud service, especially with the XenApps on Desktop service? This gets into where the Citrix will manage your license server, the SQL database, so the site database, configuration logging, monitoring, the delivery controllers, and in some instances the storefront, if you were to leverage the storefront service. And then using a technology called a cloud connector, it would then talk to our control plane over 443, and you would be able to manage that resource location, in this instance being a public cloud subscription or multiple subscriptions, multiple vendors, all from a centralized platform. We're thinking of, think about if you're on 7.x today, going into Studio, utilizing Director, you're connecting into some of your on-premise servers, you'd be connecting to a cloud service to manage these workloads. And one thing to keep in mind too, and even though we have storefront today, you can still, like in the cloud service today, a lot of enterprises are utilizing storefront within their resource location or within their cloud subscription for additional flexibility regarding branding and utilizing that investment of moving towards storefront. So there is flexibility with the service where you can use your on-premise NetScaler, on-premise storefront from that access control plane, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So after talking through a few of these separate models, really the next question gets into, okay, how do we go make Citrix on a public cloud, how do we make Citrix on a public cloud a reality? How do we go through, the process, say you're starting from scratch, or for instance, there's other departments within your organization who've adopted cloud and now you're starting to go through their policies and understand, okay, how do we reuse Citrix within these policies? Are there things we need to consider? What do we need to change? I like to really break this down into three separate phases, really: assess, connect, and build. And starting with assess, it really focuses on understanding your user requirements, going through and evaluating your users, breaking down their requirements, understanding where their applications are, where their data needs to be, going through and also understanding the performance benchmarks of the public cloud vendor you're going to use. So for Azure, understanding what type of instances provide consistent performance at a cost that you can afford based on your enterprise agreement. How about the storage and the storage accounts, and what type of IOPS performance can you expect, as well as understanding the costs. How is this going to change our overall business model as we shift from this on-prem usage, on-prem applications, and shift towards consuming cloud-based, consumption-based resources. So let's dig into assessing user requirements a little bit deeper. How do we really recommend going through this process and talking through your users and trying to understand who to pivot towards the public cloud first, especially if you're starting from scratch? Typically, we recommend really looking at users where the application portfolio facilitates, a hybrid model. You're going to be at a point in time where you're going to have applications with back-end data that, are going to have to exist on-premise for a time period, but are there any, task-based applications if you're hosting it with XenApp, or, end users on VDI who have maybe applications that are really all locally installed? Think of like an HR worker, which is Office, Adobe Reader, some internet browsers, where they would access a few web applications. These are groups that make the most sense, because especially when you start getting into that hybrid atmosphere, like you're starting from on-prem, you're in that cloud builder phase, you're trying to understand the policies and you want to shift to cloud, it's new. You really want to be mindful of the location of that user and their data. And then also by targeting something simple and something that you can do in a way where you're not going to break that close proximity between that app and its data where you might impact performance, you can use that to build confidence. You can do it in a scenario where, let's target something. There's a lower business criticality for this application, but it's something that we can get a lot of business impact by shifting it to the cloud. So say, for instance, if it's like a seasonal app, you're seeing peak usage during like the summer or winter months, depending on like it's like a finance app like the end of the year, and you know that you're going to have enhanced capacity. You're going to need greater capacity. Why rack all these servers? Let's just have it where we can consume this application in more of a pay-as-you-go consumption-based model. Let's focus on this app. Before we even get to a forklift, why don't we create a host connection, build a new zone in Citrix, or for instance, maybe you don't want to even touch the production site. Let's forklift and build a smaller site for this specific use case and deploy, our task worker-based desktop with, Office, so we can do a more seasonal workload for some of our administration staff and power up VMs, power things down. So this is something that can be approached in definitely a phased way. And as long as you're mindful of that location of the user data and the app data, this is something just like we recommend on-premise. You want to focus on keeping things consolidated in the cloud as well, because that's going to have an impact on performance. So definitely approach, to go through the user group. This is where you want to start. User experience is critical, and focus on, okay, is this something we can drive a good business impact? Is this something that is simple where we can go and build some confidence as we go through this process? And then the next piece here is really understanding the benchmarks. You might be shifting from, how you're sizing workloads on premise to sizing workloads in the cloud. And it's different. You're going to be paying hourly for what you consume. So you want to make sure you're using something that is going to be efficient. Thankfully, on the Citrix side, we've run through some testing in the Azure front as well as slightly in the AWS front as well, where there's optimal workloads based on some of the login BSI profiles like task workers, knowledge workers that provide an optimal dollar per user per hour. With public cloud, especially being more consumption-based resources, when some things are off, you're not getting charged for that. So understanding like the dollar per user per hour, you can really understand what instances for your workload is going to drive the greatest business value. So for Azure, we see the D2, B2 instances tend to be where you're in a more optimal scalability sense, as well as that cost parameter as well. So it's something definitely worth starting there. There is DV3 instances that have just been released that have more memory per CPU at a similar cost. So it's kind of an example there of really, each data center is a little bit different, and definitely you're at a point where you can start with an instance size that makes more sense for your organization. And the great thing about cloud as well is you can scale as you grow. You can scale as you go. You can start small, build up. If you're using like an EBS-backed instance in AWS, that capability is there as well, where you can start with like an M4 extra large, test that out, see what the scale is, and find out what the dollar per user cost for your workload is. And then if you want to scale up or scale out, maybe bump to like a double X large or provision additional extra larges, there is a cost impact that we will get into a little bit later as we go through some additional instance considerations. So thinking of those instance sizes, and especially the fact that you can start with a certain allocation of resources of that CPU and memory and really scale up, especially in AWS as well as Azure, through a reboot of that instance. So thinking, let's start with D2 version 2 based on Citrix's scalability testing for AWS. Maybe test M4 extra large for our XenApp instances on that realm. You can scale up as you go. Now, the thing with public cloud instances, you're being charged for that compute, the network storage that you're using. So things like pooled resources where you're sharing sessions within, say, a XenApp-based model or pooled desktops, that's where you can take the biggest advantage of that on-demand nature of pricing. Since a resource is pooled, if not a lot of users are using it, say, in off hours in the middle of the night, it's something where you can utilize power management, utilizing either something like Citrix Power Management for pooled VDI or utilize enhanced power management capabilities like Smart Scale by create like load-based and schedule-based scaling for your RDS workloads to take advantage of that. For instance, if you're being charged by the hour, especially if you're buying, on-demand instances within AWS or some of the standard models within Azure, where, if we're at 80% capacity from 9 to 5, let's start powering down and have maybe 20% capacity at night, so we get charged less per hour. So it's definitely something worth considering and thinking through, especially as you start to approach this problem, like on-prem, trying to shift something where you're running it 24/7, where you might on-premise, like that's something that might be more expensive for your use case when it comes to cloud. It's something you definitely want to take advantage of, especially if you're evaluating initial use cases to bring to the cloud. It's like, let's try to see if there's one where maybe it's more, it's pooled, it's something that's a little bit simple, we can take advantage of that overall price model. And this kind of gets, again, into just some of the cost profiles. And I want to kind of get an example of, as you're looking at, using some of the instances we recommend for a starting point, and you want to, what do we, especially in an on-prem world, you always get, hey, let's scale up. It's more, less servers for us to manage versus scaling out, where we're kind of creating, additional servers, all the same configuration, maybe a little bit smaller, spreading out our overall failure domains. Now, with the overall cost per user per hour, especially when you're charged hourly, and you start getting into that power cycling, especially for a pooled resource, the smaller servers, or things like D2, V2, or maybe you've tested that, you want more CPU, D3, V2, to get a couple more users on there. When you start to power these instances down, it gets into, how do we bleed off these users? For instance, we have, we're hitting off hours. We have a server where maybe there's 3 or 4 users on it, and we can't power it down just now. That's where things like idle policies, disconnect policies become very critical. And it also poses a challenge when you go with a very large instance, say, for instance, if you want to manage fewer servers, where it's much harder to take advantage of that overall cost cycling. It gets to a point where, if you have very large instances, maybe it's similar when you kind of spread it out. Okay, 24/7, we have a few large instances, or a larger amount of smaller ones. 24/7 costs may be similar, but you lose a lot of efficiency in terms of the power operations. For instance, it'll be a lot harder to get 20, 40 users off of a server versus 15 to like 18, based on some of the numbers that you saw previously for a D2, V2. So it's definitely something worth considering. You may need to approach how you do sizing today when in public cloud to really take advantage of the cost models that are associated with the overall platform. So just a couple high-level considerations, just kind of summarize the overall session is, user workflow, very critical, understanding application requirements and where your application data is going to exist in this push to the public cloud. For instance, are there any apps that we might need to test, splitting out the data just because of the overall criticality of this workload that we want to move to the cloud? Let's test it. Let's go ahead and move in that direction. And if it doesn't work, we can use Citrix Cloud, for instance, and have on-prem and cloud-based resources and manage them appropriately, as well as instance types and pricing. Again, take advantage of the flexibility of public cloud. Start with smaller, cheaper instances for your infrastructure, for your workloads, and if you need to, maybe bump up a size or two as the project progresses. So then, as you start getting more data on your scalability and how much you're utilizing the environment, you do it in an efficient way. We also have a cost calculator out there as well for Azure. Definitely check it out if you want to try to gauge, and do an additional cost estimate for some of your use cases on the platform. So the next piece I want to cover is really connecting. Once you've gone through and you understand just the cost constraints and understand the instance and those performance, as well as your overall use cases, the next piece really gets into bridging your data center and connecting and leveraging that public cloud subscription. So starting with the public cloud subscription itself, especially in terms of Azure, is resources exist in that subscription. They exist in that account in Azure or AWS. There needs to be some form of governance associated with this, because that's how resources are billed. That's how resources are managed, and they tend to be separated between accounts. So understanding and setting up governance between your teams, especially when there's teams that manage, for instance, like the network versus the storage, going and understanding how those resources are going to be divided up from a role-based access control perspective is very critical. And another thing with subscriptions as well, and this is something that, even though there is a significant amount of scale compared to On-premise that you might have your buying servers that's more fixed, is the subscriptions do have limits. For instance, with Azure, you have a limited number of cores per subscription in a region or VMs. And so these are things that you definitely want to review prior to deploying a workload within a public cloud. Understanding, okay, if you go forward and you start to build out this large-scale VDI use case, if this is something that's shared, for instance, if you're sharing this overall subscription or this account in the AWS terminology, you want to make sure and be mindful of these limits, because you might get in a scenario where you might constrain limits from other departments. You want to be able to grow. The other departments want to be able to grow. And some of the limits that are on the screen, that are not displayed on the screen, but also apply to public cloud subscriptions is, when you create resources, it's not running from a hypervisor in your data center. You are sending commands to an API, and those APIs tend to also have throttling limits against them to prevent denial of service attacks. So for instance, if one team is running a big process and then you're sharing a subscription with that team from your Citrix environment, you start to power on and create a handful of machines, some of that might be throttled. You might see longer power on times compared to what you're used to on premise when you have that dedicated resources versus utilizing a orchestration layer that's multi-tenant and shared across hundreds and thousands of customers. So when it comes to subscriptions, and especially the management of those subscriptions, really taking the time to determine and create a good hierarchy and governance on how they're going to be managed, talking through the limits, and are we going to utilize this subscription, or how resources are built and organized in a public cloud way. Are we going to share this across systems, or you have finance, you have Citrix, you have other technologies that are being deployed on the public cloud all bundled into one subscription? Or is it worth let's separate this out and let's dedicate a subscription to Citrix? This is something that we want to isolate these resources within within our public cloud. We have an account that can have multiple subscriptions. It might be easier for billing. We have all of these resources that can be dedicated to Citrix. That's something that's worth considering, especially I've seen some instances where I've seen organizations trying to grow and then they hit some limits because another organization was provisioning machines for their system. They have to set up and increase the CPU limit associated with that subscription. And when it comes to departmental billing and departmental organization, Microsoft also tends to recommend setting up dedicated subscriptions for departments for simplicity. So it's something worth discussing and really going over the requirements within your organization. And this kind of gets into those cloud policies I mentioned earlier, where you'd establish some of these policies as you move towards the cloud and start to consume cloud-based infrastructure. So review these limits and understand where you're moving as an organization and how its impact may be on the growth and long-term management of the environment. Next piece is really connecting your data center. As you get into this hybrid cloud model and you start getting to a point where you're going to have workloads on-prem, you're going to have workloads in the public cloud, it really gets into how are we going to connect the data center. There are multiple options in public cloud, typically between VPNs as well as dedicated connections like an express route or a direct connect for AWS. Definitely take the time to review just the parameters and constraints of these models. Typically, VPNs are all over or internet access. They use IPsec and will connect from an edge router into an Azure or AWS. Express route or direct connect is something where you would go to someone like an Equinix or like one of your ISP providers, and you'd create a private connection from Azure or AWS to your data center. So this is something where a lot of larger enterprises, for like their headquarters or for their overall organization, they'll create an express route for an Azure-based workload. I've also seen some smaller customers where they would use more of the robust VPNs to work with, just a small, branch office and connect that to Azure to have hybrid resources. So it's something definitely to work through. And really a lot of this gets into, where are you going to connect? Where are the resources that we're going to connect to from a public cloud perspective? So starting off with, excuse me, like zones, especially with the extend architecture, and you're looking at a point where, we're going to have an on-premise Citrix site, and we want to utilize a, Azure-based or AWS-based zone connected through something like a, express route or, this VPN if it's smaller. if you're a smaller organization like in the SMB or mid-market, you want to definitely understand the latency and understand, what's the latency between our data center and this Azure or AWS data center to understand the performance. And always when you're looking at a point where should we do, a cloud-based zone or set up a dedicated cloud site, it always also comes down to your availability requirements as well, for maintenance cycles, especially with a site database, et cetera. So thinking of connectivity, and again, thinking about that point in time where you're going to be in a hybrid atmosphere between your on-premise data center as well as a Azure or AWS resource location, thinking about how you're connecting, how much bandwidth you need to go through those two connections between that VPN, what type of VPN model do we need if you're going to go that route, maybe for a smaller branch office to save costs, or just for a proof of concept, for instance, before you create that dedicated connection through an express route or VPN, as well as how much outbound and inbound data. This is something that is typically charged for. Typically, inbound data is not charged within a public cloud. Outbound data is. There's also metered versus unmetered, but you really need to understand what data is going to be going through that connection, because if you have it routed where you have users, for instance, connecting on-premise and they're hitting applications within your public cloud subscription, if that pipe, that connection, whether it's a VPN or express route, starts to get constrained due to other systems, maybe data replications occurring because of other organizations, other departments within your organization that you're replicating in maybe AD data because you've set up a domain up there, you're replicating application data or database information. If that starts to get constrained and users' ICA sessions are connecting over that, they will see, an impact in their overall user experience. So understanding these connections between your environment, that public cloud, and how user connections are going to be routed through those VPNs, express routes, direct connects, it's something that you definitely want to consider and review because it can have an impact on user experience depending on where they're connecting from, depending on how utilized it is. There are ways to kind of help with this with, NetScalers in the public cloud, utilizing optimal gateway routing and having users maybe, in certain areas connect over the internet to an externally facing NetScaler versus through your private connections and through that express route or VPN to save that information, save that bandwidth. But definitely, start as you're looking and approaching and you've gone through these use cases, you've started to understand the performance and understand just how that performance is charged and how does it really differ in how we consume public cloud resources. Start looking as you're getting ready to experiment, look for data centers that are closest to your proximity. What's the latency or at least closest to the use case that you're going to present if you're going to be moving all of your data into that public cloud location like a forklift model. And also data centers, not all data centers are created equal in public cloud. But make sure once you've determined the data center you're going to target for that initial workload or that initial Citrix workload, make sure the services and like the instance sizes you're targeting are within that preferred data center. Like I mentioned earlier, with some of the newer series of instances that are coming out, consistently between the public cloud vendors, they are released in different areas over others initially. So if you're targeting something like an N series where it has a virtual GPUs for like a 3D graphics-based workload, those might not be all available in every single data center. So it's definitely something considering when you start going through this connectivity conversation. So the next piece, now that you've assessed your requirements, you understand your initial business goals and how it applies to costs, and you've gone through and had those governance conversations regarding subscriptions and understanding how resources are consumed and certain constraints there, and then gets into creating those building blocks and setting up that public cloud IaaS infrastructure to deploy then your Citrix infrastructure as well as your Citrix workloads. So the first piece comes to setting up that Azure or that AWS infrastructure, whether it be creating your resource groups and setting those up and delegating role-based access control permissions to subsets based on your Citrix team, your storage team, your network team, or setting up a VPC and building out the networking for that. Setting up and having a great naming scheme, especially in Azure, where renaming resources is critical. And then when it goes to Azure, you need to then build out, for instance, that topology. You need to build out the resource groups, networks, understand how you're going to do storage, as well as the impact of how the vendor you choose, whether it be Azure with availability sets, AWS with availability zones, how that's going to impact the availability of your environment. And once those parameters are established, that's when you really want to then start creating virtual machines. Definitely recommend taking the time and due diligence to really think about the long-term impact of setting up the right delegation of resources, setting up the virtual networks and their constraints, and how everything's managed on the overall longevity of your Citrix environment. So starting is with resource groups and some lessons learned here, especially on just future current Azure projects. Resource groups in Azure Role Resource Manager are really how Azure contains resources and bundles resources together. They're also a container for, as a container for resources, they also help facilitate permissions. For instance, we've worked with some customers where they've had, a dedicated Azure subscription, but you're going to have for Citrix, but we needed teams from the network side and storage side to also be able to leverage and utilize the environment to provide, core services critical to the usage of Citrix. So, file servers with file shares for profiles that would be managed by a storage team, the virtual networks, the connections between, the cross-subscription networking, between the Citrix subscription within Azure and between the core subscription within, managed by the other departments within that customer. They also need to manage the network. We need to delegate that out. So as you approach, especially in the Azure perspective, as you approach that, role-based access control with your Citrix environment, make sure you delegate out the resources in ways where you can provide granularity. And as you go into and approach this upfront, setting up new regions or expanding to other clouds, you've gone through those cycles and you've started to translate some of those current roles and responsibilities from some of your existing infrastructure teams into, what do those resources look like in cloud? How do they manage those resources? Let's get these policies put in place so that when we want to expand to another data center, it's just really just replicating and utilizing, ARM templates to add all of your delegation to either a new subscription or a new region as it's been established. So definitely think granularity when it comes to resource groups. Break out things, from your Citrix infrastructure. You want to have separate resource groups for your workloads. I also recommend separate resource groups for storage. So for instance, if you're starting to manage like golden images, you can delegate that out if you have someone on a desktop team that's not going to be creating those base images for you for consumption into the Citrix environment. Another piece as well, especially with, that core infrastructure, and these things are, a little bit harder to change over time if you realize that, hey, we need to maybe change the subnets a little bit differently, maybe use multiple virtual networks, is setting up a virtual network in a way for your Citrix environment, again, that kind of has that granularity. Within virtual networks in whether it be AWS or Azure, they'll typically you'll have your VPC, you'll have your virtual network, and then you can break it out into a series of subnets, which is where you then apply things like your network security groups. Think of those as, the public cloud-based firewalls blocking out specific ports, allowing certain traffic to communicate to one another. That's applied at a subnet level. Same with user-defined routes. For instance, if you don't want your Citrix workloads to communicate to that gateway subnet, you want it to communicate through like a firewall virtual appliance. You can apply a user-defined route to that subnet and control that traffic. So separating out and going through especially when you create a dedicated Citrix virtual network and adding some of that granularity, where you have dedicated subnets for your infrastructure and dedicated subnets for varying workloads, that gives you that flexibility. So definitely recommend approaching this in a way where it's going to facilitate long-term management in the environment and create subnets for workloads based on their type. I've seen customers separate out Windows 10 based workloads from server workloads, maybe because they wanted to set up a user-defined route or set up network security groups where certain app workloads they want to know outbound internet access, whereas certain desktop app workloads they want to provide that capability. They were able to do that because of the granularity they added to their virtual network architecture. So going from virtual networks and thinking about availability in the Azure model, this is done through availability sets. Availability set is pretty much telling Microsoft, especially with the resource management, that these are machines that I want separated out in ways where they're highly available, where they're going to be placed on what Microsoft calls fault domains, which is pods of hardware that are all interconnected, so that, for instance, if there's a power outage or an issue within a data center, that's one single failure domain, as well as update domains. This is how Microsoft organizes infrastructure for planned or unplanned maintenance. You want to create availability sets for each tier within a Citrix system, so for your NetScalers, storefront, delivery controllers, in a way where you're then telling Microsoft that these are components critical to my infrastructure. We want to split these out and make sure that they're going to be highly available regarding your maintenance. From an Azure perspective, this is something that needs to be done upfront prior to machine creation. And this is a similar, it's a concept that you also want to apply in AWS as well with availability zones. Availability zone is, an AWS data center within a region. If you place all of your components in a single availability zone, that's going to create a single point of failure at the public cloud vendor level. So if AWS were to hit an issue with Azure US East, 1E, then and all of your infrastructure was there, that would be a full outage. So typically you also want to separate your infrastructure components across availability zones, which will all have very low latency connections because they're all within the same AWS region. And then going from the on-premise model to approaching availability sets with Citrix Cloud, similar to what was highlighted before on the previous diagram, taking your delivery controllers, your SQL, those core pieces of infrastructure in that traditional 7.x model, same concept. Your cloud connectors, if you're looking towards Citrix Cloud and utilizing the Citrix-based control plane to manage your Citrix infrastructure, these cloud connectors would also want to be in an availability set to make sure you have optimal availability of the environment. So some considerations for deploying Citrix infrastructure, especially some of the supporting services that we utilize from a Citrix perspective. Web and SQL platform-based services, like the web services on AWS, Azure, et cetera, are not yet supported. So these aren't things that you can use for your traditional storefront server or setting up a SQL database if you're doing a forklift for your Zen desktop site. Azure Active Directory domain services is something that is supported today for if you're utilizing Azure and you want to offload and create a cloud-based domain, as well as Azure Active Directory. It's something that can be done with Citrix Federated authentication services. Of course, based on the resources users are connecting from, it's thinking about how they're authenticating, and there are implications on someone connecting with Azure AD, hitting a resource within your domain that Windows authenticating into file shares, et cetera. There are things that need to be considered there. When it comes to the disk support, especially from an Azure infrastructure perspective, clustering is not supported, so you want to utilize things like SQL always on availability groups, or from a file perspective, things like storage spaces direct for any sort of profile redundancy. When it comes to NetScaler VPX, especially shifting from a VPX model in your current hypervisor to utilizing NetScaler VPX within like an Azure Marketplace or AWS, take the time to review the supported features in Citrix product documentation. Microsoft as well as AWS, they do control that underlying network differently between the vendors. So there are capabilities in VPX that are not available compared to what you see on premise. So take the time to go through and see if there's any features that impact your current utilization of NetScaler. Within Azure, originally when we were released NetScaler on Azure, there was single IP limits, but now you can do something with multi-NIC as well as multi-IP capabilities within Azure VPX. This is also available within AWS. And when setting up a active-active configuration within Azure, you can utilize the Azure Load Balancer to have two standalone nodes, or even set up an active passive HA configuration. In AWS, utilizing things like the Elastic Load Balancer to provide a similar configuration that is not yet available, but you can set up an active passive configuration in AWS by having two NetScalers within the same availability zone. And definitely something I recommend if you're going on that route as a follow-up, to go through and understand the considerations for that configuration. Looking at things like NetScaler Global Server Load Balancing, this is something that is supported in Azure. You can use it for DNS level load balancing between multiple data centers, et cetera. So the next piece as well, and especially getting into some of the considerations like we mentioned before around like SQL and file services, setting up things like the delivery controller, cloud connectors, storefront, you're consuming at that point just infrastructure as a service based workloads. A lot of the optimizations and configuration steps you would follow today to go through that process would be similar to what you would do within a public cloud. With all the with all the considerations around subscriptions, virtual networks. And then these are also components, like the delivery controllers, the SQL database that are included as part of the cloud service for Citrix Cloud. So once you've gone through and you've set up your initial infrastructure, you've had the conversations about, are we going to have a dedicated subscription for Citrix? Are we going to share these resources across the organization? And you've built your Citrix infrastructure, it then gets into deploying the Citrix workloads. There are machine creation services available on AWS as well as Microsoft Azure. These services utilize the native API of that cloud vendor to provide that single image management capability that you see with on-premise MCS today. Provisioning services is not yet available in the cloud, so if you are moving towards public cloud, this is something, and you're using PBS today, taking the time to evaluate MCS is definitely recommended. There are some differences between how you'd manage, especially versioning, things along those lines. Now getting into a little bit more granular detail of the Azure MCS service on how we communicate and leverage and utilize the Azure API to provide that single image management. When you create ready to create that host connection between Azure, you're going to use something that's known as a Azure Active Directory Service Principal. Think of this as a service account. From the AWS standpoint, you would use AWS Identity and Access Management to also create a similar service account for that service. Now, when you utilize Azure, you can utilize locally redundant storage. It can be standard, premium. If you're utilizing a hybrid use benefit to save licensing, that is something that's also supported with the Azure MCS service. Now, this also brings some of that dedicated subscription for Citrix, where you have that billable set of resources for the Citrix environment within the overall account that your organization sets up with Azure. This is something where utilizing the MCS service, you are going to be creating resources within that public cloud subscription. There are ways to lock it down. There are also ways to provide greater levels of automation by having higher levels of provisions. So as you go through and start having some of those conversations regarding your subscription governance and how you're going to set it up, there are implications on how you would then manage that MCS service, because it does leverage role-based access controls or within that subscription. And then on the AWS side, any identity and access management permissions associated with your AWS account as well. So definitely something worth considering. There is a setup guide and guidance available for configuring the Azure MCS service, as well as guidelines for configuring the AWS MCS service. Definitely something I recommend taking a look at, especially as you go through this full assess, connect, and build process as you approach Citrix on a public cloud. So definitely a lot of things to consider, and we're here to help you through this process, especially with our guidance and with our overall services organization. So what are the ways, especially as a cloud builder, if you're just getting started, if you're a cloud consumer, you already have some cloud footprint, you want to adapt it to Citrix, or if you're a cloud broker where you're at the point where you have a very evolved cloud practice, maybe running full departments on Citrix, and you want to try to diversify into multiple vendors to provide greater flexibility, what are ways that we can help through this overall process?
Thank you, Kevin. So I know that was a lot of good information that we covered, and that a lot of information that we dumped on you guys. So we wanted to circle around and really show you how Citrix can really help you achieve success with your overall cloud initiative. Now, as with any of our Citrix products, our goal is to really drive customer success and integration, especially with Citrix Cloud and cloud-based technologies being fairly new. We understand that there's a lot of pressures of design and integration associated with a new product line. This is where we can really come and assist with bringing resources and experts who are intimately familiar with intricacies and the requirements of cloud in general to really reduce the risks and the rework and truly maximize your investment in the cloud, right? So to begin, let's take a look at what is actually included within your Citrix Cloud entitlement. As part of the Citrix Cloud service, each customer is assigned what we refer to as a customer success manager. Now, the goal of this CSM, if you will, is to really increase the partnership between Citrix and yourself and really drive the successful implementation of your Citrix Cloud deployment. Essentially, as you succeed, we succeed. Now, moving on to the various service offerings provided by the Citrix Consulting Service to really achieve that success with your cloud initiatives. While we offer quite a large selection of different service offerings, each customized to each customer's unique requirements, what we really want to cover is some of the most popular offerings that are requested by our large customer base. First and foremost is the Citrix Cloud Transition Assessment. The purpose of this offering is to really work hand in hand with you guys to better understand what your cloud strategies are and really identify the gaps and the prerequisites that really need to be completed to truly achieve a successful integration with both Citrix Cloud and the public cloud. Now, there's no single right way of migrating to the cloud, and we really want to work with you to determine what's the best path forward for your unique scenario. And the Citrix Cloud Transformation Assessment will really allow us to lay down the preliminary work for moving to a cloud platform. Moving beyond the initial assessment is our fundamental detailed architectural design engagement. This engagement is really critical to the success of any cloud deployment. The detailed design engagement allows us to lay down the core foundation of what the migration really is going to truly entail. We go pretty in-depth into determining what the blueprint for your cloud deployment will look like, from specific details such as sizing for the infrastructure components, location, communication, the backend application layers, the optimal routing for the users and workflow traffic, as well as any ancillary components such as operations, monitoring, change control, Azure D, and etc. Kevin, feel free to chime in here with any additional subjects that we do cover in the detailed design, but it is very, very granular. Where we want to go into is various configuration settings such as the network architecture, user application requirements, detail optimizations. This is what is really going to truly drive the success of the future build of a cloud environment. Now, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and to add what Tony said too, especially the granularity, a lot of the conversations we had earlier, especially about, how should, Citrix fall within your existing, cloud governance and subscription model and network connectivity. A lot of these conversations occur in this design. So this is something we definitely recommend customers look at, especially for, large strategic, long-term cloud consumption, especially for their Citrix workloads.
Definitely. Thank you, Kevin. And as Kevin said, having a fundamental and secure foundation is truly instrumental in having any successful cloud deployment. Now, going beyond the design is our standard environment build offering. Now, this environment build is really customized and tailored to each customer's environment and each customer's requirements based upon what that design entails. What it allows us to do is allows us to bring our large base of Citrix Cloud experts and cloud experts in general to really quickly build and expand upon your cloud environment based on that design and the detailed architecture. Now, we have the flexibility to be able to quickly onboard and offboard resources to really ensure the timely completion of your cloud initiatives and really meet your project timelines and your commitments. Finally, another key engagement that's highly popular with our customer base is really we do offer what amounts to our Citrix Cloud pilot engagements. The purpose of this remote-based service offering is it allows us to work hand in hand with your team to not only determine the initial high-level requirements and strategies for your overall cloud initiative, but really as well as build a pre-production sandbox environment that you guys can play around with and really understand the technology better. The best way to learn the technology is really to get your hands dirty, and this engagement allows you to really understand the intricacies of what a Citrix Cloud deployment entails, as well as any ancillary components, in addition to piloting that actual pre-production environment with a single targeted use case within a confines of a fully functional pre-prod. Right? So this allows you to get your hands wet, get your feet wet, and really understand what the technology entails and what the requirements are that you have to keep in mind when going down a future cloud production-ready cloud deployment. Lastly, what we want to cover is our managed workload service. So while Citrix Cloud by nature will take ownership of the update and management of the core infrastructure components, the brains, if you will, we do have additional offerings to really extend that support and that update and that general optimization of the components of to the actual resource layers. that's the servers, the desktops, all the actual individual VDA agents in themselves. This service allows you to really refocus your efforts to what's going to truly drive the benefits of your company, right? Such as engineering, new feature expansion, and architecture, rather than becoming bogged down in the day-to-day activities such as server upgrades, agent upgrades, and general support calls. So the managed workloads team will integrate with your existing change control processes and can be treated as essentially an extension of your existing Citrix teams. Lastly, while Citrix Cloud by nature will take ownership of the update and management of the actual core infrastructure components, the brains, if you will, we do have an additional offering to really extend that support beyond just the infrastructure components and really to the actual resource layers, such as the servers and the desktops and et cetera, right? So that support and update will really drive supporting the update of the VDAs and then generally the general operationalization of those components. This service offering allows you to really refocus your efforts to what's going to drive benefits to your company, such as engineering, new feature expansion, and architecture, rather than becoming bogged down in the day-to-day activities such as server upgrades, agent upgrades, and general support calls. So the managed workload team will really integrate within your existing change control processes and can be treated as essentially an extension of your existing Citrix teams. Finally, what we would like to cover is specifically around education. Now, with any of our Citrix product base, training, and specifically administrative training, is critical to the successful implementation and management of the overall solution. As such, we really wanted to highlight our specific courses that are geared towards both Citrix Cloud as well as Citrix integration and deployment with Microsoft Azure. So the key course which comes to mind is the CXD 252 course. At the core of this course really is the intent to educate people on the differences between the traditional XenApps and desktop on-premise model and the future state of Citrix in the cloud and Azure. Now, looking forward, we want to announce that we will actually be releasing our cloud certification next year. But for a limited time prior to the release of the exam, anyone who completes the CXD 252 course this year will automatically be certified upon release of the cloud certification exam next year.
Thanks, Tony. So going over some of the key takeaways, especially when it comes to designing and deploying Citrix on a public cloud, a lot of the leading practices that you follow today in that on-premise model, especially when most of the services consume, just IaaS, building, your Citrix just in someone else's data center, being Microsoft or AWS, a lot of those leading practices still apply today. Optimizing profiles, keeping user workloads and app workloads as close to the data as possible. Setting up and optimizing and ensuring, your infrastructure is in a highly available configuration. Your base image is optimized and set up with visual settings in a way that optimize bandwidth and ICA connectivity. That still applies in public cloud today. And for the changes and a few of the differences that we really highlight on this webinar, you can use a phased approach. A public cloud really gives you a lot of power in really setting up things in phase approaches and taking a footprint away where you build your footprint over time, where you can add use case on use case. You're not buying a bunch of servers and utilizing capital expenses that you want to leverage as quickly as possible. It's something that you can grow over time and you can build over time. And as you go through this process and you look through that, assess, that connect, that build for Citrix on public cloud, our professional services team is here to help, and we can help you along the way. So thank you again, everybody, for listening in. And all right, now that before we move into the Q&A, I would like to remind everyone in our audience that if you have any questions for myself or Tony, you can submit an Ask the Question button on the screen, or simply type the question in the text box and hit submit. Thank you again very much, and now we'll answer your questions. We did run a little over with some of the content, so that I do apologize, but we want to stay on and run with some live Q&A as well and answer some of your questions. So I'm going to get started. And any questions that we can't answer in the time, even though we'll go over a couple minutes, Tony and I will follow up with a blog highlighting some of the key takeaways and questions from some of the audience. So to start, and this is a fairly common question we see in the field, if we are looking at Citrix Cloud and the storefront service, is branding and customization allowed? Right now, the current version of the Citrix Cloud storefront, think of that as a default standard storefront install. It is maintained in terms of availability and updates and such as part of the service, but some of the granular customizations you may need, such as branding or disabling subscriptions, aren't yet available in Citrix Cloud. We did announce the Citrix Workspace service at Synergy that will include some additional flexibility like branding, but a lot of what we're seeing in the field, especially at the enterprise where you need some of those granular customizations, is the use of the standard traditional storefront. You can integrate traditional storefront and aggregate, especially if you're looking at the cloud service version of Citrix on public cloud. Your traditional 7.x or 6.x with a Citrix Cloud environment into a traditional storefront. And this is something that we're seeing fairly often in the field, especially with needs for customization. So looking to the future for branding, Citrix Workspace, if you're looking at cloud service now, you can provide some of those capabilities through traditional storefront and aggregate your additional on-premise traditional Zen desktop with a Citrix Cloud environment into the same storefront deployment. Moving to a next question, it really gets into, it looks like there's a few on PVS as well as app layering support for public cloud. I'm probably going to take both of those questions and probably merge some of the answers together a little bit because I think they're both fairly related. Right now, today, there is no provisioning services support in public cloud, whether it be AWS or Azure. Both of those services, vendors require machine creation services. And that's primarily due to just the public cloud vendor itself locking down certain aspects of layer 2 and layer 3 networking, preventing some aspects such as like pixie booting and things along those lines that are pivotal to the use of provisioning services. From an MCS standpoint, and especially if you're utilizing 7.x today, the deployment of machine creation services in a public cloud and some of the operations are very similar to using machine creation services in Citrix Studio. If you're evaluating public cloud and you're using provisioning services today and you have a test environment available, it makes sense to maybe create a machine catalog with machine creation services, go through that process. But there is a difference in machine creation services from on-premise to the cloud. We use the native cloud APIs as we discussed a little bit earlier. And there are ways to efficiently deploy that, especially with things such as app layering. And that's kind of where getting into some of those app layering questions on the call to kind of pivot towards that a little bit is app layering is available. There's a connectors for Azure. It can also be leveraged in AWS using the file share connector if you set up an IaaS-based file server. And when you move towards, if you're a provisioning services shop now and you're moving towards machine creation services, app layering can definitely help with the process, especially in the realm of where you can, the platform layers, you can kind of have your provisioning target device tools. You can then have a different platform layer for any Azure-based tools if you're using the Azure MCS service. And since Azure MCS uses a VHD-based method for that master image, you can then create a layered image and utilize, different set of platform layers for provisioning services, different set of platform layers for your Azure MCS, and you can utilize that to help facilitate some of the transition. So that is something that app layering is available in cloud with a built-in connector for Azure today, and ways to use in AWS with that IaaS-based file server and using the file share connector. And then another question, and again, I appreciate everyone. I know we're running a little bit over, but I want to make sure we kind of answer a handful of these. And then another question is, other than using availability sets, are there any other availability recommendations for high criticality Citrix applications in public cloud? That's a great question, and especially when it comes to shifting your data center to a data center that's managed by another vendor. Azure, AWS, they do have SLAs associated with their services. But one thing to always keep in mind, it is infrastructure that is managed by another vendor and something that needs to be maintained in terms of planned and unplanned maintenance. From the Azure perspective, Azure will have sister paired data centers. So for instance, they won't, if a data center is paired with another one, it won't run planned maintenance on both data centers within that pair at the same time. So for instance, setting up the availability sets and setting up different sites in two separate Azure data centers to split failure domains as well as meet some of those maintenance requirements is something that you can do to kind of add additional availability. Another thing to keep in mind as well is also the number of fault domains and in the AWS circumstance, availability zones within a specific data center. Those are how they allocate really that physical hardware, and can you consider that as like its own failure domain or own pod within that data center? So for instance, Azure US East has 3 fault domains. So for instance, if you're looking at a Citrix environment, we're going to start having in the realm of 5,000 or more users, you might want to start adding 3 or more delivery controllers. And in that circumstance, you might have pieces of infrastructure that are sharing fault domains within that cloud. So it gets to a point where you might want to consider spreading out failure domains based on the number of users within your specific site by doing multiple sites or multiple resource locations, looking at the overall Citrix Cloud service. So thank you very much for that question. And then I think the final question that we will wrap up on, I know we're 5 minutes over time, is it possible to route ICA traffic so it doesn't necessarily have to flow through constrained pipes to the data center, such as ExpressRoute? This is something we see fairly often as well, is the ExpressRoute, especially when you get into that hybrid cloud or direct connect in the AWS circumstance, is going to be utilized by a lot of different services in the data center. So they might have database teams replicating databases to public cloud. You may have app teams shipping apps and then do maintenance and utilizing that as well. Management traffic going between for like that domain replication. One thing you can do, especially from a internal connection standpoint, if you're doing like a direct standard ICA connection, like connecting through and authenticating through Storefront, your ICA may go through that ExpressRoute to hit that VDA and connect directly. So that ICA traffic going through the ExpressRoute, if the ExpressRoute gets constrained, you could see an issue with user experience and performance. Another thing you could do is also with optimal gateway routing. You can have it where users that are internal, they authenticate, they access internally. And then instead of going direct to the VDA, you could go to a NetScaler gateway and then go through your office's like internet connection. Instead of routing through directly through Azure, go through and hit securely that NetScaler that's in a DMZ you've created in your Azure Virtual Network as one way to separate some traffic outside of that ExpressRoute if you find your ExpressRoute getting constrained. Also, when you go through that ExpressRoute conversation with a service provider to set up your data center, they can be scaled over time as well. So make sure you have that conversation that if you see that growth in the future, if it starts getting constrained, that you can scale to a pipe size that's going to meet the needs of your business for that forecasted growth. So thank you again, everybody, for attending the session today. And again, apologize for running a couple minutes over, but we hope that you found value in a few of the Q&A afterwards. And any additional follow-up questions that are listed, Tony and I will make sure we set up a follow-up log to kind of highlight some of the key points discussed in the webinar today. But thank you, everyone, for attending. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.